My name is Loretta May Hutchins, and I was 58 years old the night I stood in a hospital parking lot and handed a stranger the keys to my car. It was a Tuesday in late October. The kind of night where the air smells like wet leaves, and the sky is that flat, grey color that means rain is already on its way. The man from the used car lot was polite. He counted out $42 bills on the hood of the big, and set them in a neat stack the way people do, when they want you to feel good about something that doesn't feel good. He shook my hand. He drove away. I stood there until the tail lights disappeared. Then I turned around and walked back through those sliding glass hospital doors, back down the linoleum hallway that smelled like antiseptic and microwaved soup, back to room 14, where my great-uncle Walter was asleep in a hospital bed with a half-eaten cup of orange jello on the tray beside him. No flowers. No cards on the windowsill. No family in the plastic chairs along the wall. Just Walter, and the soft beep of the monitor, and the sound of the rain starting against the glass. I sat down in the chair beside his bed and opened my phone to check the balance on the account I'd just deposited the money into. Enough to cover the new prescription the cardiologist had added. Enough to get through the month. Walter's hand was open on the blanket. Loose, the way hands get when someone's deeply asleep. He was 81 years old, and he'd worked those hands for 6 decades, and they were telling on him now. The raised knuckles, the sun damage, the thin skin you could almost see through. I didn't touch it. I just sat there next to him and listened to the rain. I had no idea what he had put in writing 8 months before. I had no idea what was in a file folder in an attorney's office across town, with my name on the outside. I only knew that it was 10:30 on a Tuesday, and someone needed to be in that room, and I was the only one who had come. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. If you've ever been overlooked by the people who should have valued you most, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what happens next changes everything. Walter James Hutchins was born in 1943 in rural eastern Tennessee, the youngest son of a tobacco farmer, who believed that the best thing a man could do with his life was work it hard and complain. Walter took that lesson seriously. He spent 38 years as a county road surveyor for the state of Tennessee. Not a glamorous job. Not the kind of work that gets you written up in the paper or honored at a banquet. But it was honest work, precise work, the kind where you have to be right the first time, because mistakes become permanent. He and his wife, Nora, raised 3 children in a modest ranch house in the county seat: Gary, Darlene, and Mitchell. Nora was the warmth in that house, everyone agreed on that. She was the one who remembered birthdays and made the potato soup and kept the peace between Walter's silences and the children's noise. When she died of a stroke in 2007, the house got quieter than any house should be. And the children, who were by then adults with their own lives in other states, drifted further away. Walter's neighbors described him as self-sufficient. His former co-workers called him meticulous. His children, when pressed, used a word that tells you more about them than it does about him. They called him difficult. I need you to sit with that for a second, because that word is doing a lot of work in this story. Difficult usually means a person who requires something from you. Walter required honesty. He required that you be where you said you'd be and do what you said you'd do. He didn't accept excuses, and he didn't perform warmth he didn't feel. If you came to Walter with a problem, he'd look at it square and tell you what he actually thought, not what you wanted to hear. To some people, that's difficult. To me, after a lifetime of people who told me what I wanted to hear, and then did exactly what they wanted to do, it felt like a glass of cold water on a hot day. But I didn't know Walter yet. Not in 2007 when Nora died, not in the years after. I was a distant great-niece. My grandmother had been Walter's older sister, and we'd crossed paths maybe 3 or 4 times at family gatherings over the decades. He was the older man who sat off to the side at holiday dinners, more interested in watching the weather radar on his phone than making small talk. I thought he was aloof. I was wrong about that. He was just done performing for people who weren't performing anything real in return. After Nora died, the visits from Gary, Darlene, and Mitchell went from occasional to rare to functionally non-existent. There were always reasons. Gary lived in Phoenix and had a busy job. Darlene had her own health problems. Mitchell had 3 kids and a schedule that made it hard to get away. These are real things, real pressures. I'm not dismissing them. But I have learned that when the reasons stay the same for years on end, they stop being reasons and start being choices. Walter managed on his own until he couldn't. In August of 2021, he had a fall in the kitchen. Nothing broken, but it scared him enough to write a letter, handwritten, 3 sentences on a piece of notebook paper, to 3 people he thought might actually come. I was one of them. I'm not doing as well as I was. I could use someone to check in. If you have the time. That was the whole letter. No drama, no begging. Just the plain truth of an 81-year-old man, who had spent his whole life refusing to ask for help, and had finally decided the situation required it. I got the letter on a Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, I was on the highway. The drive from where I lived in Knoxville to Walter's place in Maryville was 40 minutes. I'd told myself I'd stay the weekend, see how he was doing, make sure the house was in order, and head back Sunday afternoon. That was 3 years ago. When I arrived that first Friday, I found Walter sitting at his kitchen table with a pot of instant oatmeal that had gone cold, a pile of mail he hadn't opened in 2 weeks, and a medication organizer with 4 compartments still full, because he couldn't remember which pills were which anymore. I sat down at his table. I didn't fuss over him, because I could already tell he wouldn't want that. I just asked him to walk me through the medications, and we spent the next 2 hours sorting it out together. Then I made dinner, real dinner, the kind that required chopping, and we ate at that kitchen table, and he told me about the last survey job he'd been on before he retired, a property line dispute out near the county line, that had taken 3 months to resolve and left 2 neighbors who'd been friends for 30 years barely speaking. He told it the way a person tells a story they've been holding onto for a while. When I got up to do the dishes, he said, without looking up from his coffee, "You didn't have to come." "I know," I said. He nodded once. We didn't talk about it again. But I want you to understand what that small exchange meant, coming from Walter Hutchins. He wasn't thanking me. He was telling me he saw me. He was telling me that he understood I had chosen to be there when I could have chosen otherwise. That was how Walter said everything that mattered, sideways, briefly, without ceremony. I stayed through Sunday. Then through Monday. Then I called my employer and asked about remote work options, and by Tuesday, I had reorganized my life around a man I barely knew in a ranch house 40 minutes from my apartment. I did not tell anyone in the family I was doing this. There was no one in the family to tell. Gary had been called, one of the other people Walter had written to. He'd called back to say he was worried, that he was looking into options, that he'd try to get out there soon. He didn't ask if anyone else was coming. He didn't offer to help with the cost of anything. He said soon, the way people say soon when they mean not yet, and hope you'll forget they said it. Darlene never responded to the letter at all. Mitchell sent a card. A card, to a man in a house 40 minutes from civilization, with a medication organizer he couldn't figure out alone. So I organized it. I made a spreadsheet. I work in hospital billing. Spreadsheets are how I love people, with every medication, every dosage, every time, every refill date. I scheduled the appointments, the cardiologist, the primary care doctor, and the follow-up with the specialist who'd reviewed his blood work. I learned the back roads between his house and the hospital. I stocked the kitchen with food he could actually eat, and cleared out the expired things that had accumulated in the cabinets. I set up a system for the mail. Walter watched me do all of this without comment, the way a man watches a person do a job they clearly know how to do. One afternoon about 2 weeks in, he set his coffee mug down on the table and looked at me across it. "You sold something," he said. It wasn't a question. "My car," I said. "I bought a cheaper one." "It's fine." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his mug again. "HMPH," he said. That was all. But coming from Walter, that HMPH was the equivalent of a speech. What I didn't know then, sitting at that kitchen table across from an 81-year-old man eating soup I'd made, was that he had already noticed everything. He had already made a decision. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in his hall closet was a folder that would prove it. A folder none of his children knew existed, labeled in his careful surveyor's handwriting. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew the soup needed salt, and Walter pretended he didn't notice that I'd added it, and for the first time in months, the house felt like somewhere someone actually lived. People ask me sometimes how I afforded it. The honest answer is, I barely did. Not really. Selling the BIC bought me a few months of room to breathe. My remote work covered the basics, but my income was designed for one person living alone, not for one person living 40 minutes from home, covering someone else's copris, and running on 5 hours of sleep. I picked up extra shifts in the evenings when Walter was settled for the night. I learned which pharmacies had which generic equivalents, and which ones would match a discount card I'd found online. I stopped eating out. I stopped buying things that weren't necessary. None of that felt like sacrifice at the time. It just felt like math. What surprised me was what grew up in the space I'd cleared. By the second month, Walter and I had a routine. I was up at 6 to start the coffee. He wanted it strong, no nonsense, the way he'd made it his whole working life. He'd come out of his bedroom around 7, we'd sit at the kitchen table, and for the first 20 minutes, we didn't say much. Just drank our coffee and listened to the news radio he kept on the counter, an old box unit with a dial you had to tune by hand. He loved that radio. He told me once that he'd been tracking weather on it since 1979. That there was something honest about weather, it didn't negotiate, didn't soften, didn't tell you what you wanted to hear. A front was coming, or it wasn't. Rain by Thursday, or clear skies through the weekend. The radio told you what was real and left the rest to you. I started to understand that the radio wasn't just about weather. It was a philosophy. Our conversations were like that, too. Slow, honest, with long stretches of quiet that didn't need filling. He'd ask me about my work, what it was like billing for a hospital, how the system functioned, where the gaps were. He was genuinely curious, the kind of curious that comes from a lifetime of solving problems rather than just talking about them. He'd ask follow-up questions. He'd remember things I'd said 2 weeks earlier, and come back to them. No one had listened to me like that in a long time. One evening in November, I was paying his utility bills at the kitchen table, while he sat across from me sorting through a box of old photographs. He'd pulled it out of the hall closet, a cardboard showbox, the kind that holds memories that don't fit anywhere else. He was quiet for a long time, turning the photos over one by one. Then he slid one across the table to me without saying anything. It was a photograph of Nora. She was laughing at something off to the left of the frame, her head tilted back. She looked like a woman who laughed easily and often. "She would have liked you," Walter said, looking at the utility bill and not at me. I set the bill down. "Yeah. She liked people who did things," he said. Instead of just talking about doing them. We sat with that for a while. Then he reached back into the showbox and pulled something else out, not a photograph. A small brass key on a worn leather cord, the kind of cord that looked like it had been retied several times over the years. He held it for a moment, running his thumb along the teeth. "What does that open?" I asked. He looked at it the way you look at something you've carried a long time. Then he put it back in the box and set the box aside. "Something that needs opening," he said. I let it go. That was another thing I'd learned about Walter. When he was done talking about something, he was done, and pressing further just made the walls go up. Whatever the key opened, he'd tell me when he was ready. Or he wouldn't. I'd learned to be at peace with either. December brought the first real cold, the kind that settled into the bones of an old ranch house and found every gap in the window framing. I bought weather stripping at the hardware store and spent a Saturday afternoon sealing the drafts while Walter supervised from his chair with the authority of a man who had spent his career measuring things to the inch. "You missed one," he said, not looking up from his radio. "Which one?" "Corner by the back door." He was right. I was on my knees with the weather stripping tape when he said, quietly, into the room, "Gary called yesterday." I sat back on my heels. "What did he say?" Asked how I was doing. A pause. "What did you say?" Told him fine. Another pause. He said he'd been meaning to get out here. Said he had some things to take care of first. I went back to the weather stripping. I didn't say anything. "I told him not to hurry," Walter said. There was a weight to those 4 words that sat in the room long after we'd changed the subject. It was January when Gary actually called me directly. I didn't know he had my number, but Walter must have given it to him at some point. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, while I was sitting in the hospital waiting room during one of Walter's cardiology appointments. Gary's voice was warm. The practiced warmth of a man who knows his calling about something uncomfortable and wants to get out ahead of it. "Loretta," he said. "I've been meaning to reach out. Dad talks about you a lot." "I'm glad he has someone to talk to," I said. A small pause. "We've been worried about him," Gary said. "As a family. Mitchell, Darlene, and I have been talking, and we really think it might be time to consider some kind of assisted living arrangement. Something with professional care. It would take the pressure off you." I looked at the waiting room wall. There was a motivational poster with a sunrise on it. "Walter is getting excellent care," I said. Of course. I just mean," Gary shifted his tone slightly. Became more confidential. More man-to-man, even though neither of us was a man. There might be some things we need to discuss. As a family. About his situation. Financial things. It might be better to have those conversations without, Without me, I said. I was going to say without burdening you. I appreciate the concern, I said. But Walter makes his own decisions. The call ended politely. I sat in the waiting room for a few more minutes after we hung up, turning the conversation over in my mind. Financial things. That was what Gary had wanted to talk about. Not Walter's health. Not whether he was eating. Not whether his blood pressure was controlled. Financial things. I filed that away the way I file things I'll need later. When Walter came out of his appointment that afternoon, I didn't mention the call. We drove home with the radio on low, the announcer reading out the weekend forecast. Cold but clear. Good driving weather. How'd it go? I asked. Doctor says I'm not dead yet, Walter said. High praise. Thought so, he said. We drove the rest of the way home without talking. The radio called for clear skies through Sunday. Walter had his hand on the doorknob like he always did on long drives, a habit he'd probably had since the 1960s and never thought to break. The county roads rolled past in the grey afternoon light. In the hall closet at home, in a filing cabinet I'd reorganized twice, without ever opening the locked drawer at the bottom, a folder sat waiting. I didn't know that then. I only knew that the afternoon was quiet and the roads were clear and Walter was still here, and that was enough for today. They came in February. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, even for them. They came in a careful sequence, each one arriving with reasonable explanations and warm hellos, each one circling the same territory, with slightly different words. Gary came first. He drove in from Phoenix on a Thursday, stayed through the weekend, brought a nice bottle of wine and a framed photograph of Nora and Walter from what looked like the 1980s. He was taller than I'd expected, silver-haired, with the comfortable ease of a man who had never had to hurry for anything. He spent the first day being genuinely kind. He and Walter walked the property together, slowly, Walter's pace, and I could hear them through the window sometimes, Walter's low voice and Gary's laugh floating back toward the house. It looked real. I wanted to believe it was real. That evening, after dinner, Gary helped me carry the dishes to the kitchen. His voice dropped to that confidential register I'd noticed on the phone. "You know, Loretta, Dad's lucky to have you." He set a bowl in the dish rack. "But I've been thinking. You've been here a long time. You have your own life. We really should be looking at some options that don't put everything on your shoulders." "Walter's comfortable," I said. "Of course, he is. But there are wonderful facilities." "He's comfortable here," I said. Gary looked at me for a moment. Something recalibrated behind his eyes. "Well," he said pleasantly, "we'll keep talking about it." Darlene came the following weekend. She brought a casserole in a dish she asked for back before she left, which I thought was an interesting choice. She was smaller than I'd imagined, brittle in the way people get when they've been angry for a long time and don't know what else to do with it. She sat with Walter for 2 hours and then spent the rest of the time in the kitchen with me, asking questions that were shaped like small talk, but were actually inventories. Had Walter mentioned any legal documents lately? Did I know if he'd spoken to an attorney recently? Was he clear on what his assets looked like? I answered the way Walter had taught me to answer things I didn't want to answer. I kept my face pleasant and my answers short, and I offered her more coffee twice. Mitchell was the most direct. He came on a Tuesday alone, no family, no gift. He sat at Walter's kitchen table for 40 minutes, mostly listening while Walter talked, and then he found me in the back hallway with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said what the others had been building toward for 2 weeks. "I want you to know we're very grateful for everything you've done," Mitchell said. "Truly. But Walter is our father. These are family decisions that need to stay with the family." He paused. "It would be better, for everyone, if you stepped back a little. Let us take over the care piece. You could go home. Go back to your life." I stood in that hallway and looked at him. "Walter asked me to come," I said. "Of course. And that was the right call at the time. But we're here now. We're here now." As though 2 days in February balanced against months of nights and pharmacy runs and driving to Maryville in the dark, because his blood pressure spiked and I needed to be there. I didn't argue. I'd been around enough people like Mitchell to know that arguing wasn't the point. The point was to make me feel like a guest in a place where I'd been doing the work of a family member, to reframe the months I'd spent as an intrusion rather than a commitment. I said, "I'll talk to Walter about what he needs." Mitchell's smile stayed put. "Of course," he said. "Of course you will." That evening, after all 3 of them had left the property and the house was quiet again, I went in to say goodnight to Walter. He was propped up against his pillows with the radio on, tracking a weather system moving in from the southwest. How was the visit? I asked. He didn't look at the radio when he answered. Same as every visit. Which means? They showed up late, he said. And asked the same question 3 different ways. I sat down on the edge of the chair by his bed. Gary asked about facilities, I said. Darlene asked about documents. Mitchell asked me to leave. I know, Walter said. A pause. What do you want me to do? I asked. He turned the radio down, just slightly. Not off, he never turned it off, but down. Stay, he said. Just the one word. And then, after a moment, the kind of moment where he was deciding how much to give away, I took care of what needed taking care of. Long before they showed up. What does that mean? He looked at me, and there was something in that look I hadn't seen before, not sadness, not sentimentality, but a kind of quiet certainty. The look of a man who has done the math and is satisfied with the answer. You'll find out, he said. When the time comes, you'll find out. He turned the radio back up. Storm watch, the announcer said. Fronts moving through by Friday, clearing by the weekend. Walter closed his eyes. I turned off the lamp and went back to the kitchen, and I stood at the window for a while looking out at the dark yard and the tree line, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all of it. Steady. I felt steady. I didn't know what Walter had done. I didn't know what was in the locked drawer of the filing cabinet, or the sealed envelope he kept in his nightstand, or what his careful surveyor's handwriting had put down on paper in an attorney's office somewhere across town. I only knew that he had said stay, and he had said I took care of it, and those 2 things together felt like more than I'd had in a long time. If you've ever carried something heavier than your circumstances should require, carried it quietly and without asking anyone to notice, comment I see you below, and subscribe, so you're here for the part of this story I've been building toward, because we're not there yet. April brought the first warm week of the year, the kind that tricks you into thinking spring has arrived for good when really it's just scouting. Walter was having a good stretch. His energy was better, his appetite was up, and he'd taken to sitting on the back porch in the afternoons with his coffee and his radio, watching the yard like a man inventorying a piece of land he intended to leave better than he found it. One afternoon, I came out with the second cup and sat in the other chair, and we watched a pair of cardinals working a feeder I'd put up in March. For a long time, we didn't say anything. Then Walter said, "You know what I did before I retired?" "Surveyed county roads," I said. "Surveying," he said, "is about knowing exactly where things start and where they end. The exact line between what's yours and what isn't. Most people guess. Most people think they know the line, and they are off by 20 feet, and they don't find out until someone digs it up." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. I spent 38 years drawing exact lines for people who were too vague to draw them themselves. I waited. When Nora died, he said, I decided I was done being vague. About what was mine, what I'd worked for, who it should go to. He looked at the cardinals. "Your 3 cousins, they think they know where the line is. They've been guessing at it for 15 years. And?" I said. "And they're off," he said. "By a lot." I set my coffee down. "Walter." He looked at me sideways. "There's a folder in my filing cabinet. Bottom drawer, the locked one. Keys on the cord in the nightstand." He paused. "I'm not telling you to open it. I'm telling you it exists." "Why are you telling me it exists?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that collects itself before a true thing. "Because Gary came here last week wanting power of attorney," he said. "And before that, Darlene called the county recorder's office asking about property records in my name. And Mitchell has spoken to a real estate attorney in Maryville. I know because his assistant is friends with mine. He turned to look at me fully now. They're not visiting because they care how I'm sleeping. They're visiting because they've done the math on what they think they're inheriting. And the math they've done is wrong. I sat with that. How wrong? I said. Wrong enough that this conversation is important, he said. He stood up, slowly, and took his coffee back inside, and at the door, he stopped and said one more thing over his shoulder. I called a lawyer in the fall of 2020. The year before I wrote you that letter. I wanted to make sure things were in order before I asked anyone for anything. He looked out at the yard. I made sure the things I worked for go where they should go. He went inside. I sat on the porch. The Cardinals were still at the feeder. The radio murmured from inside, weather on the weekend, clear turning partly cloudy by Monday. I thought about what he'd said. The exact line between what's yours and what isn't. 38 years of drawing those lines for other people and then, quietly, carefully, drawing his own. That evening, after Walter had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time thinking about a man who had handed over a ranch, who had watched his children come calling only when the math looked good, who had given up nothing in the way of bitterness and found, somehow, in his 81st year, a way to be at peace with all of it. In June, Mitchell called me one more time. The polite approach was gone. His voice was flat, efficient. We need Loretta to sign a caregiver agreement, he said. Our attorney recommends it. For protection, yours and Dad's. I knew what that was. A caregiver agreement, if drafted a certain way, could formally define the scope of care, the compensation, and the boundaries. In the wrong hands, it could also be used to argue that a caregiver had been paid, that they had received consideration for their time, and therefore had no basis for any other arrangement. I'll have my own attorney look at anything before I sign it, I said. A long pause. You don't need an attorney, Mitchell said. This is just paperwork. Then it won't be a problem for me to review it, I said. He hung up. I sat in the kitchen afterward and thought about what it meant that they were trying to put my role in writing now. They hadn't thought to do that when nobody else was showing up. They'd thought to do it now, after they'd seen what was in front of them. I thought about Walter on the porch. The exact line. The folder in the locked drawer. I called a family law attorney the next morning, not about the caregiver agreement, just to understand the landscape. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Haynes who specialized in elder law, and she listened to the situation for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Has he told you anything about what his estate plan looks like?" "Only that he's taken care of it." "All right. Then let him. Don't sign anything without counsel, and don't have any conversation with his children that you don't document." "Why document it?" "Because," she said, "in my experience, when adult children come calling with attorneys and caregiver agreements, they're usually trying to establish a paper trail. You should have one too." I started keeping notes after that. Dates and times and what was said. Not because I was preparing for something, I wasn't. I was just doing what Walter had always done. Drawing exact lines. Making sure I knew where they were. By August, Walter was getting tired in a way that didn't announce itself dramatically. It wasn't a sudden decline. It was more like the afternoon light in late summer, a little less bright each day, the angle shifting, the shadows coming earlier, and you'd look up one day and realize the long evenings were almost gone. He slept later. He left his coffee half-finished for the first time in the 18 months I'd known him. On the days when the weather radio tracked a distant system, he'd sit with his hand resting on it the way you'd rest your hand on something solid when the ground feels uncertain. I adjusted everything around him without making a production of it. Smaller meals, more frequent. Medications at the same hour every day without fail. Shorter walks, closer to the house. I learned the rhythm of his tired days versus his good days, and I planned accordingly. Appointments on the good days, quiet afternoons on the rest. One Tuesday in September, Gary called again. His voice had lost the warmth entirely now. "We've hired an elder care consulting firm," he said. "They're going to assess Dad's situation and recommend next steps." "Walter's situation, is that he's in his home being cared for," I said. "He's declining, Loretta." "A professional assessment." "Walter decides what he wants," I said. "Not a consulting firm." "You're not family," Gary said. Finally, cleanly, without the softening. "You are not his family." I let that sit in the air for a moment. "No," I said. "But I'm the one who's here." I hung up and stood in the kitchen. Through the window, Walter was on the back porch despite the chill, his radio in his lap, his eyes closed, his face turned up toward the October sun. He looked like a man listening to something no one else could hear. I went out and sat with him. I didn't say anything about the call. After a while, Walter said, "Cold coming." "This weekend," I said. "Front moves through Friday." He nodded. "I want to show you something," he said. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a business card, worn at the corners. He held it out to me. "Margaret Ellison, attorney at law. Estate and family trusts. She has a copy of everything," he said. "When the time comes, whatever time that is, you call her first. Before you call anyone else." I took the card. "Walter." "Don't," he said. "Not unkind. Just clear. I've made my arrangements. They've been made for a while. I just want to know, where to start." I looked at the card. Then I looked at him. "Okay," I said. "Good," he said. He put his hand on the radio. The weather band was quiet for once, just static, comfortable and low. "Now let's sit here and not talk about it." So we did. In October, Walter had a hospitalization, 3 days, a fluid issue that his cardiologist addressed and resolved. When he came home, he was tired in a new way, and something in the house felt quieter, the particular quiet of a space that understands what is coming, even if no one has said it aloud. His last genuinely good week was in late October. He ate well. He was sharp and present and funny in his dry, half-spoken way. One afternoon, he asked me to bring him the showbox from the closet, and we went through it together. He named everyone in every photograph, their relationship to him, and a brief story attached to each one. He did it methodically, the way he'd have surveyed a property line, starting at one edge and working to the other without skipping. When we got to the bottom of the box, the brass key on its leather cord was there. He picked it up and held it for a moment. Then he looked at me and pressed it into my hand. "Keep this," he said. "Margaret will tell you where it goes." I closed my fingers around it. The last thing he said to me on the last ordinary evening was nothing remarkable. It was Thursday, the weather radio was calling for rain by Saturday, and I'd made soup for dinner, the same soup I'd made the first night, because it had become our dinner by then, the way certain things become yours without you deciding. He finished his bowl. He said the soup was good. I said I'd tell him it was good tomorrow, so we didn't have to waste time on it. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, short, dry, genuine. "Good night, Loretta," he said. "Good night, Walter," I said. He died on a Wednesday morning in November. I knew before I opened the bedroom door, the way you know a house has changed before you've seen it. The radio was still on. The chipped blue enamel mug he'd used every morning for decades was rinsed and upside down on the drying rack. He'd washed his own mug the night before. 81 years old, tired in a way that didn't have a medical word for it, and the last thing he did was rinse his cup so I wouldn't have to. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. Then I did what you do. I called the doctor. I called the funeral home. I found Margaret Ellison's card in my wallet. And because they were his children and it was the decent thing, even then, I called Gary. He answered on the second ring. Gary, I said. Walter passed last night. There was a silence. And then, and I want you to understand that I will hear this for the rest of my life, the first words out of his mouth were not grief. They were not even surprised. Has anyone called the estate attorney? He said. His father was not yet 4 hours gone. And his first question was about the attorney. I said I had to go. I hung up. The radio murmured. I made myself a cup of coffee in Walter's mug and sat with it until it went cold, just to know how it felt, just to sit for one more morning in the place where we'd sat together every morning for 2 years. The funeral was the performance that Gary, Dorleen, and Mitchell gave their best. They stood at the front of the chapel in their good clothes, the three of them forming a shape that looked, from a distance, like grief. Gary shook hands. Dorleen accepted hugs. Mitchell said something about legacy and character that was technically accurate and entirely hollow. I stood in the back in a dark dress, and I said nothing, because there is no winning the grief performance against people who have been practicing it their whole lives. Margaret Ellison was at the service. I spotted her near the door, grey-haired, composed, carrying a leather folder under her arm. She found me afterward, pressed my hand, and told me the reading would be at her office. 2 weeks out. He was very specific about who should be in the room, she said. She gave me a look I didn't know what to do with. Not pity. Not sympathy. Something more like, I know something you don't know yet. And it's all right. The 2 weeks before the reading were their own weather system. Gary told 3 of the cousins that I had inserted myself into Walter's final years. Dorleen posted a memorial on social media about a devoted family standing by their father to the end. Mitchell stopped returning my calls, which was fine. The calls had stopped being useful months ago. I kept Walter's radio on in the evenings. I kept his mug on the windowsill. I wore the brass key on its leather cord, tucked under my collar the way he had worn it. It had weight to it, a specific small weight that I noticed every time I moved. The morning of the reading, I drove to Margaret Ellison's office building, low brick, her name on a plaque by the door. Gary's car was in the lot. Dorleen's rental. Mitchell's truck. I sat in my car for a moment with my hand on the steering wheel. I wasn't hoping for anything. I want you to understand that. I hadn't shown up in that hospital room 2 years ago, because I was calculating an outcome. I hadn't sold my car, or reorganized my schedule, or learned the back roads between Maryville and the hospital, because I was building a case. I did those things because Walter asked me to come, and I came, and then I couldn't stop. What I was hoping for, sitting in that parking lot, was that the next hour would be honest. That the room would finally contain the truth. Whatever truth that was. I went inside. The waiting room smelled like good coffee and old paper. Gary sat with his legs crossed, already practicing patience. Dorleen was on her phone. Mitchell stood near the window, arms crossed, not looking at me when I came in. We were called into the conference room. Margaret sat at the head of the table. The leather folder was in front of her. Beside it, a metal lockbox, the kind with a small keyhole in the front. I felt the brass key against my sternum. Margaret opened the folder. Walter updated his estate documents in the spring of 2022, she said. A year and a half ago. These are his final instructions. Gary shifted in his chair. Margaret read plainly. No drama. Walter would have approved of that. The estate was modest, the house, valued at approximately $220,000. The property, 8 acres including the back 40, Walter had quietly repurchased from a neighboring parcel in 2019 when it became available. A retirement account, 31 years of state employee contributions, compounded. A second account Margaret described as a holdings account. She paused before reading that number. $214,000. Saved over decades, added to consistently, never touched. Darlene made a small sound. Walter also directed me to note for the record, Margaret said, looking around the table over her reading glasses, that the $60,000 disbursed to Gary in 2018 for a business matter, and the $40,000 disbursed to Mitchell in 2020 for a mortgage issue, were recorded in this estate as advances against their shares. They have been counted accordingly. Silence. Gary's jaw moved, but nothing came out. Those advances come off the top, Margaret said. They are not gifts. They are recorded transactions. She drew a single sheet from the folder and laid it flat. Under the terms Walter put in place 18 months ago, after deducting those advances, the shares allocated to Gary, Darlene, and Mitchell are as follows. She read 3 numbers. They were not small. Walter had been fair. But they were, in the context of what Gary and Mitchell had already received, significantly less than they had been calculating. Darlene said, "That's not right." Margaret looked at her. "That's what he signed," Margaret said. Then she reached into the lockbox. She'd used a key of her own for that, and set a sealed cream envelope on the table in front of me. "The remainder of the estate," she said, "including the house, the property, and the balance of the holdings account, passes to Loretta May Hutchins." Walter was specific and explicit, and I will read his instructions exactly as he wrote them. She unfolded a piece of paper. His handwriting, blocky, careful, the hand of a man who spent his career making sure measurements were correct. She read, "To my children, I hope what you've received is enough. I gave you advances when you asked, and I didn't ask questions, and I don't have grievances about it. I just want it noted, for the record, that I kept records. To Loretta, you didn't open the envelope I gave you to keep. You didn't ask what was in the lockbox. You didn't ask me what the key was for, or what I'd arranged with Margaret, or what you were going to get out of any of it. You just made the soup and drove me to appointments and learned which roads were fastest in the dark. That is the only reading of a person I have ever trusted. The property is yours. Take care of it the way you took care of me. I washed my own mug. I didn't want you to have to." Margaret set the paper down. Gary stood up. His voice came out controlled but thin. She manipulated him. He wasn't incompetent. "I have a full capacity assessment on file," Margaret said, without raising her voice. "Signed by 2 physicians. 14 months before his death. You're welcome to contest it. I'd encourage you to speak with your own counsel first about the cost of doing so against a documented record." Gary sat back down. Darlene was crying. Not the performance kind. The real kind, the kind that comes when you've been running a story for so long, and the story runs out. Mitchell looked at the table. I sat very still and held the brass key in my closed hand under the table. I won't tell you it felt like triumph. It didn't. It felt like the specific, weightless grief of winning something you would have traded back in a heartbeat for one more morning at the kitchen table with a man who drank his coffee from a chipped enamel mug and told you what was real. I stood up. I said the only thing I had to say, and I said it to the room, because all 3 of them needed to hear it. Walter took care of the important things years before any of us arrived, I said. I just took care of him. I picked up the envelope. I nodded to Margaret. I walked out of the conference room into the hallway, and out through the front door into the November morning, cold and clear, the kind of day where the air is so honest it almost hurts. I sat in my car for a long time. The brass key was still warm from my hand. Here's what happened after. The property is mine. The house is mine. I spend 3 days a week there now, keeping it the way Walter kept it, nothing fancy, nothing wasted, everything that works kept working. The holdings account funded the cardiologist, debt I'd been carrying since month 4, and the remaining balance I've set aside. A portion of it is going toward a small fund I'm building, in Walter's name, quietly, the way he'd want it, for families who are caring for aging relatives alone, without support, covering costs no one sees. It will pay a month of utilities, or a medication copay, or a one-time gap that would otherwise break someone who is doing the right thing. I call it the Hutchins Fund. No plaque. No website. Just an account that does what Walter always believed money should do when it's been earned right. Take care of someone who needs it. The radio is on my kitchen counter now, the old weatherband unit with the dial you tune by hand. I keep it on low in the evenings, the way he did. The announcer's voice reads out fronts and pressure systems and temperatures to a house that mostly goes about its business, and I find I don't mind the sound. The chipped enamel mug holds my pens. Some mornings, before I leave the house, I touch the brass key on its cord, the one I wear under my collar now, the same way he wore it for years. The one that opened a lockbox in an attorney's office. The one that opened a folder labeled in careful surveyor's handwriting. The one that opened, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. Walter told me once that the difference between a promise and a legal agreement was simple. A promise depends on the person who made it, he said. A document depends on the law. He spent 38 years working in the law. He trusted it more than he trusted people. And when the time came to protect the one thing he wanted to protect, not his money, not his property, but the truth of what had happened in the last 2 years of his life, he went to Margaret to listen, and he put it all in writing. Some things you write down, he told me once. He did. If you've ever been the person who showed up when nobody else would, tell me your story in the comments below. Share this with someone who still believes kindness and loyalty matter. And subscribe for more unforgettable stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.